Say it again, the alien queen whispered, and Ethan Cole realized the worst mistake of his life had just been promoted to something far more dangerous. The palace hadn't just gone quiet. It had collapsed into a kind of silence that felt engineered, like the air itself had been instructed to hold its breath. 100 feet of polished obsidian floor stretched beneath him, reflecting the towering arches of living metal that curved overhead, each one pulsing faintly, as if the structure were thinking about what he had just said. Ethan stood exactly where protocol said he should stand, hands loosely at his sides, posture respectful, expression neutral in the way you practiced when your job depended on not being memorable. It had been working for years. It stopped working about 3 seconds ago. He became aware, in layers, of everything that had changed. The guards lining the chamber walls were no longer scanning the room. They were scanning him. Advisors frozen mid-motion, one with a data slate hovering inches from his fingers, as if even gravity had decided not to interrupt the moment. Somewhere behind him, a translator unit gave a soft mechanical chirp and then went very, very quiet, like it had reconsidered its entire purpose. Ethan inhaled slowly, because panicking in front of an alien monarchy seemed like a poor career move, even now. He replayed the sentence in his head, word by word, searching for a way it could possibly mean something else. It didn't. He had addressed Queen Lyra Valeas, ruler of a system that measured authority in fleets and centuries, as my love. Not your majesty. Not my queen. Not anything remotely survivable. Just 2 words that did not belong in this room. That did not belong anywhere near her. And yet, here they were, sitting in the air between them like a problem no one knew how to solve. Ethan resisted the urge to close his eyes. If he did that, he suspected he might open them somewhere less official, like a holding cell or a very polite version of nowhere. Instead, Queen Lyra did not repeat herself, which somehow made the request heavier, as if the silence expected him to comply without negotiation, and Ethan realized. With a slow, sinking clarity that standing still was no longer a strategy but a decision, one that could be interpreted in ways he was not qualified to predict. So he swallowed carefully and let out a breath he hoped sounded deliberate rather than terrified. Because in rooms like this, tone mattered more than truth, and he had just learned that the wrong 2 words could rewrite his entire existence. Her eyes never leaving his, steady and searching in a way that did not feel like judgment, not exactly, but something more precise, as if she were comparing him to a memory she had not yet decided to trust. And that was worse, because memories did not follow rules. Your Majesty, he began, then stopped, because that felt like retreat, and retreat felt like admission, and admission felt like consequences. So he recalibrated mid-sentence the way he did when systems failed in quiet ways that no one else noticed. I believe, he said instead, voice even, that repeating it would not improve my situation. A faint sound moved through the chamber, not quite a reaction, more like the idea of one, quickly suppressed, and for a fraction of a second he thought he saw something shift at the corner of her expression, not a smile, nothing that generous, but a softening measured in millimeters rather than emotion. Her ears, those precise indicators he had been carefully not watching, adjusted forward by the smallest degree. Curiosity, he remembered from briefing notes, or interest, or the beginning of something that did not immediately end in disaster, which was, at this point, an acceptable outcome. You assume your situation is negative, she said, her voice low and controlled, the kind of control that suggested it had never needed to be otherwise, and Ethan considered the question with more honesty than was probably safe. Statistically, he replied, addressing a sovereign with inappropriate familiarity does not lead to promotions. Another almost reaction, this one closer to a ripple, quickly contained by the collective discipline of a court that understood the cost of being noticeable. Lyra took another step closer, the distance between them narrowing to something that felt less like protocol and more like intent, and the air shifted again, subtle but undeniable, like a room deciding to listen more carefully. And yet, she said, you chose those words. Ethan resisted the urge to correct her, because the truth was he had not chosen them so much as failed to stop them, a detail that did not improve his case. Exhaustion, he offered, because it was both true and insufficient. Human speech patterns degrade under stress. That is not what I asked, she said, and There it was again, that precise correction, not angry, not even sharp, just accurate. As if she were editing reality in real time. Ethan exhaled slowly, because deflection had reached its useful limit, and something about the way she was looking at him made evasion feel like the wrong move in a game he did not understand. It sounded familiar, he admitted, the words leaving before he could evaluate them properly. Her gaze sharpened, not outwardly, not in a way the room would notice, but he felt it, the way one feels a change in pressure before a storm. Familiar, she repeated, softer now, almost to herself, and for the first time since he had spoken, the silence in the palace changed, not breaking, not yet, but shifting, as if something long buried had just recognized the shape of a voice it had been waiting for. The word lingered between them longer than it should have, stretching time into something thin and fragile, and Ethan became aware that the palace was no longer simply watching. It was waiting, as if every system, every mind, every silent observer had decided that whatever happened next would matter in ways no one had planned for. Queen Lyra's gaze did not waver, but something behind it shifted. A recalibration so subtle it felt more like gravity adjusting than a person reacting. Her ears angled forward another fraction, no longer neutral, no longer guarded, but not open either, something in between, something searching, familiar, she said again, quieter this time. And the word seemed less like a question and more like a key she was testing against a lock that had not been opened in a very long time. Ethan felt the weight of that shift before he understood it. The way a room feels different when someone important changes their mind, even slightly, and he resisted the instinct to fill the silence with explanations, because explanations had already failed him once, and repeating the mistake felt inefficient. Instead, he let the quiet settle, which was not something humans were particularly good at, especially in rooms designed to amplify consequence. Somewhere behind him, a faint mechanical hum resumed, hesitant, like a system asking permission to exist. Again, and Ethan realized the palace itself had paused, not metaphorically, but in a way that suggested layers of technology had deprioritized everything except this moment, which was not comforting. Where, Lyra said slowly, each word placed with deliberate care. Would a human learn such familiarity with my language? There it was, not accusation, not yet, but direction. And Ethan considered the question carefully, because the honest answer was complicated, and complicated answers tended to create more problems than they solved. I did not learn it here, he said, which was true and also not helpful. Her gaze sharpened again, a slight narrowing that did not feel hostile, just focused. That is not an answer, she said, and Ethan almost smiled, because that felt familiar in a way he could not immediately place. Someone, somewhere, had said something like that to him before, the cadence of correction, the expectation of precision. It brushed against his memory and then slipped away. Before he could catch it, it is the safest version of one, he replied, and this time the reaction in the room was real, small but undeniable, a shift in posture, a ripple of attention that moved through the court like a breeze through tall glass structures. Lyra did not look away from him, but Ethan sensed the awareness spreading, advisors recalculating, guards adjusting their stance. The entire system responding to a conversation that had quietly moved beyond protocol into something else. Something unscripted. You are either careless, she said, her voice still controlled, still precise, or you are very certain of your position. Ethan exhaled slowly, because neither option felt accurate, and both felt dangerous. I am, he said, choosing the truth because it had worked slightly better than anything else so far. Trying not to be memorable. That earned him something he did not expect, not a smile, not even close, but a pause, a genuine one, as if the statement had interrupted a pattern she had anticipated. Her ears shifted again, this time not forward, not back, but slightly outward, a configuration he did not recognize from any briefing, and that unsettled him more than anger would have, because unknown reactions were harder to survive. That has failed, she said simply, and the quiet certainty in her voice landed heavier than any threat. Ethan nodded once, because arguing with observable reality seemed unproductive. Yes, he said. I am beginning to notice that. Another almost sound moved through the chamber, closer now to something human, something restrained but present, and Lyra took one final step, close enough that the space between them no longer belonged. To protocol it all, say it again, she repeated, softer now, but with a weight that suggested this was no longer about error or etiquette or even offense. This was about something else entirely, something that had recognized him before he recognized it. And Ethan felt the moment stretch, thin and precise, like the edge of a decision he did not yet understand how to make. Ethan did not move immediately, which in itself became a statement, because in a room where hesitation could be interpreted as defiance or fear, choosing stillness required a kind of control he was not entirely sure he possessed. But something about the way she was looking at him made rushing feel incorrect, like speaking over a question that had not finished asking itself. And so he let the moment settle just long enough to feel the weight of it before he inhaled quietly and spoke again. My love, this time without the accident, without the slip, the words placed carefully, intentionally, as if testing whether meaning changed when awareness was involved. And the effect was immediate but different, not the shock that had frozen the room before, but something deeper, more precise, like a resonance aligning instead of colliding. Queen Lyra did not react the way the court expected. Ethan could tell because the court did not react at all. They were waiting for her to define reality again. And she did not. Not right away. Her eyes remained on him, unblinking now, focused with a clarity that felt almost surgical, and her ears, those subtle instruments of emotion, held perfectly still for a fraction longer than natural before shifting outward again. The same unfamiliar configuration, and Ethan realized with a quiet, unwelcome certainty that whatever that gesture meant, it was not part of the standard set anyone had briefed him on. You adjusted it, she said softly, almost to herself, and Ethan frowned slightly before he could stop himself, because that was not the response he had expected, not accusation, not correction, but observation, and a strangely specific one at that. Adjusted, he repeated, buying himself a second to think. The tone, she clarified, her voice still even, but carrying a thread of something new, something thinner than curiosity and sharper than interest. The first time was error, this time was intent. Ethan considered denying it, because denial was often the safest response in unfamiliar systems. But something about the precision of her statement made lying feel inefficient. Yes, he said simply, and that seemed to matter more than it should have. A subtle shift moving through the chamber again, not visible so much as felt, like pressure changing before a storm arrives. Lyra took another step, and now the distance between them was no longer a distance at all, but a space deliberately chosen, one that excluded the court without dismissing it. And Ethan became aware that whatever this was, it was no longer public in the way it had been. Even if 1,000 eyes were still watching, say it again, she said once more, quieter now, but with a weight that made it clear this was no longer a request, not in the traditional sense. It was a test, or perhaps a confirmation, and Ethan felt something shift in himself as well, a recognition he could not place, the same faint echo that had brushed against his thoughts earlier, the sense that this exchange was following a pattern he had encountered before but could not remember where. My love, he repeated, steady this time. No hesitation, no correction, and for a single, precise second, something in the palace responded, not loudly, not dramatically, but undeniably, a harmonic fluctuation in the air, a subtle realignment in the ambient systems, as if something old and deeply embedded had acknowledged the phrase in a way the court could not. And Lyra's expression changed, not visibly to most, but Ethan saw it, the smallest shift in focus, the narrowing of her gaze not in suspicion, but in recognition, and when she spoke again, her voice was lower, controlled, but carrying an undercurrent that had not been there before. That is not how your kind should sound, she said, and Ethan felt the meaning of that settle into place with quiet inevitability, not accusation, not yet, but something far more dangerous, something that suggested the problem was no longer what he had said, but what he was, and for the first time since this had begun, the possibility surfaced clearly in his mind, that this was not a mistake unfolding, but a pattern revealing itself, and he was standing at the center of it without understanding why. The words settled into the space between them like something that had always belonged there, and that was the part that disturbed Ethan the most, not the silence, not the attention, but the quiet sense of alignment, as if he had just spoken a line in a conversation that had started long before he arrived. Queen Lyra did not step back, which in itself became a deviation from expectation, because distance was control in royal spaces, and she was choosing to reduce it, not eliminate it, but hold it at a level where observation became personal, and Ethan became acutely aware of details he had previously ignored for survival. The faint silver tracings along the edge of her ears, the way the ambient light seemed to bend slightly closer to her rather than simply illuminate, the subtle shift in the air pressure that accompanied her attention, as if the environment itself prioritized her focus. "You are not trained," she said, not as a question, not even as a statement, but as a correction to something unseen, and Ethan blinked once, because that was not the direction he had expected the conversation to take. "In many areas," he replied carefully, because agreeing with an alien queen seemed generally safer than disagreeing. But her gaze did not change, which meant that was not the answer she was evaluating. "Not trained in our structures," she clarified, her voice still low, but carrying that same precise undercurrent that suggested she was mapping him rather than speaking to him. "You do not know the protocols you are violating, yet you do not hesitate when you repeat them." Ethan exhaled slowly, because that was uncomfortably accurate, and accuracy in the wrong direction tended to create larger problems. "I hesitate," he said, "just not fast enough." That earned him another fractional pause, the kind that suggested recalculation rather than amusement. And somewhere in the chamber, a system resumed a low harmonic tone, as if testing whether it was safe to function again. Lyra's ears shifted slightly, this time forward and outward together, a configuration that made Ethan feel as though he had just triggered something he was not supposed to access. "It is not the words," she said quietly. "It is the pattern beneath them." And that was new, not something he could categorize under language or protocol, something closer to structure, to intent, to the invisible framework that guided meaning rather than the meaning itself. Ethan felt that same faint echo again, stronger this time, like a memory pressing against the edge of recognition without crossing into clarity. "I did not study your language formally," he said, choosing honesty again because it had produced fewer immediate consequences than alternatives. "Then how?" she asked, and for the first time, there was something like urgency in the question, controlled, contained, but present. "Do you align your tone with structures you should not perceive?" Ethan opened his mouth to answer and stopped, because the truth was he did not know, not in a way that could be explained. He had always been good at patterns, at hearing what others missed, at adjusting without understanding why. But this felt different, deeper, as if the adjustment had not come from him at all, but from something responding through him, and that thought settled into place with quiet discomfort. "I listen," he said finally, because it was the closest thing to a real answer he had. And sometimes it feels like the language listens back. The words hung there, simple and insufficient, and yet something in the palace reacted, not visibly, not in a way the court would acknowledge, but Ethan felt it, a subtle tightening, a shift in the ambient field, as if systems far beyond his understanding had just flagged his presence for further review. Lyra's expression did not change, but her gaze deepened, focus narrowing not in suspicion, but in recognition that had not yet decided its conclusion. "That is not possible," she said softly, but there was no conviction in it, only resistance. The kind that appears when something impossible refuses to remain that way. And then, after a pause that felt measured against something older than the room, she spoke again, her voice quieter now, almost private despite the audience surrounding them. "Unless you have heard it before," and the way she said it made it clear she was no longer asking about language, but about history, about time, about something that had crossed boundaries it should not have. And for the first time since this began, Ethan felt the ground beneath the conversation shift completely, because whatever this was, it was no longer about a mistake, and it was no longer something he could solve by choosing the right words. It was something that had already begun long before he spoke, and now it was waking up. The question did not feel like a question anymore. It felt like a line drawn across something invisible, and Ethan understood with a quiet certainty that whatever answer he gave next would not be measured by correctness, but by whether it fit a pattern he did not fully see. Queen Lyra remained exactly where she was, close enough that the distance between them had become a kind of boundary neither of them acknowledged, her gaze steady, her posture unchanged, but the stillness around her had shifted again. No longer the poised control of a ruler, but something more focused, more intent, like a scientist observing a result she had not expected to find. Ethan considered deflecting, offering something vague and harmless, but the way she had said it, the weight behind the possibility, made evasion feel like a mistake that would not remain small. If I have, he said slowly, choosing each word with care, then it was not in a way I remember. The answer settled into the space between them, and for a moment nothing happened, which in this room meant everything was happening. Somewhere in the upper structure of the palace, a faint shift in the light pattern flickered, subtle enough that most would not notice. But Ethan had spent too long paying attention to systems that pretended not to react. Lyra's ears adjusted again, this time forward and slightly inward, a configuration that felt sharper, more precise, and when she spoke, her voice carried a clarity that cut through the silence without raising its volume. Memory is not required for recognition, she said, and that sentence landed differently than the others, not as a response, but as a statement of fact, one that suggested this conversation had moved beyond personal experience into something structural, something that existed regardless of whether he understood it. Ethan felt that same echo again, stronger now, not a memory, not exactly, but a sense of alignment, like standing in the right place without knowing why it was. Right, that is not particularly reassuring, he replied, because humor had always been his way of stabilizing situations that refused to behave. And while this situation had long since abandoned normal behavior, the instinct remained. Lyra did not react to the humor, not outwardly, but something in her focus shifted, not away from him, but deeper into whatever she was evaluating. You speak as if this is random, she said, and Ethan almost answered immediately before stopping himself, because the truth was he had been treating it as random, a mistake, an error, a sequence of unfortunate coincidences, but nothing about her response suggested randomness. It felt random, he corrected, the distinction small but necessary, and that seemed to matter, her gaze sharpening again, her attention narrowing not in suspicion, but in confirmation of something she had already begun to suspect. It is not, she said, and this time there was certainty, not absolute, but grounded, the kind that came from patterns observed rather than assumed, and Ethan felt the implication settle into place, not fully formed, but present enough to be uncomfortable. If it was not random, then it was intentional. And if it was intentional, then the question was not what he had done, but why it had happened through him. Then what is it? He asked, because at some point curiosity overtook caution and the need to understand became stronger than the need to avoid consequence. Lyra held his gaze for a moment longer before answering, and when she did, her voice dropped slightly, not in secrecy, but in focus, as if the answer required a different level of attention, a pattern that should not exist, she said, and the way she said it suggested that the problem was not his behavior, but the existence of the pattern itself, and that made the situation significantly more complicated. Ethan exhaled slowly, because there were only so many ways a normal day could go wrong, and discovering that you were part of something that should not exist ranked fairly high on the list. That sounds like something I should be concerned about, he said, and this time there was no humor in it, just a straightforward acknowledgement of the situation. Lyra's ears shifted again, outward now, the unfamiliar configuration returning, and for the first time since this began, there was something like a decision forming behind her expression, not fully made, but approaching. You should be, she said quietly, and then, after a brief pause that felt measured against more than just the moment, she added, but not for the reasons you think. And the way she said it made it clear that whatever was coming next would not be about correcting a mistake, but about understanding why the mistake had never been a mistake at all. The statement did not resolve anything. It only shifted the ground beneath the conversation, and Ethan felt that shift in a way that was difficult to explain, like standing on a surface that looked solid until it subtly adjusted under his weight, not enough to throw him off balance, just enough to remind him that stability here was conditional. Queen Lyra did not step back, and the court did not interrupt, which meant a decision had already been made, not formally, not announced, but enacted through inaction. And Ethan realized with a quiet certainty that whatever happened next would not be reversed by protocol. Then I would appreciate understanding the correct reasons, he said, because at some point curiosity had become less dangerous than ignorance. And if he was already involved in something that should not exist, then pretending otherwise felt inefficient. Lyra studied him for a moment longer, her gaze not cold, not warm, but precise, like she was evaluating not just what he said, but how he occupied the space between words. And then she did something that shifted the entire room in a way no one could ignore. She turned slightly, not away from him, but just enough to acknowledge the court without looking at them directly. "This session is concluded," she said, her voice calm, controlled, and absolute. And the effect was immediate, not chaotic, not rushed, but decisive. Advisors lowered their eyes. Guards adjusted their stance. Systems resumed their functions with careful restraint, as if the palace itself understood that something had changed and was choosing not to comment on it. Ethan felt the weight of attention lift from the crowd and narrow entirely onto him, which was, in many ways, more intense than before, because now there was no distraction, no diffusion, just focus. Lyra turned back to him fully, the distance between them unchanged, but the context entirely different. "You will come with me," she said, and it was not a request, not even close. Ethan considered pointing out that he had very little say in that, but decided against it, because stating the obvious rarely improved situations like this. "I suspected as much," he replied instead, because maintaining a functional level of composure seemed like a reasonable goal. Even now, a faint shift passed through her expression, not quite approval, but something adjacent, and then she moved, not abruptly, not dramatically, but with the kind of controlled motion that made everything else in the room feel slower by comparison. She turned and began walking toward one of the side corridors that branched off from the main hall, a passageway that had been present the entire time but had somehow remained unnoticed, which Ethan suspected was intentional. He hesitated for exactly half a second, because following an alien queen into a private corridor ranked somewhere between questionable and career-ending. And then he followed anyway, because not following ranked significantly higher on that list. The moment he crossed the threshold, the atmosphere changed, the open vastness of the palace giving way to something more contained, more deliberate, the walls closer, the lights softer, the ambient systems quieter, as if this space had been designed for conversations that did not belong to the public record. Lyra did not slow her pace, and Ethan matched it without thinking, his mind working through possibilities he did not have enough information to evaluate. "You are not afraid," she said after a few seconds, not turning, not slowing, just stating it as if it were another variable she was measuring. Ethan considered the question, because fear was present, just not in the way people expected. "I am," he said honestly, "just not in a useful way." That earned him another slight pause in her stride, almost imperceptible, but real. "Explain," she said, and Ethan exhaled quietly, because explaining things that did not make sense had become something of a theme. "Fear usually helps you avoid problems," he said. "This does not feel like something I can avoid." Lyra stopped walking then, smoothly, precisely, and turned to face him again, the corridor narrowing the space between them even further, removing the last illusion of distance. "Correct," she said, and for the first time, there was something unmistakable in her gaze, not curiosity, not suspicion, but recognition that had begun to take shape. "Because this did not begin here," she continued, her voice lower now, more focused, "and it will not end with you leaving." And the way she said it made it clear that whatever pattern she had identified, it extended beyond this moment, beyond this place, beyond anything Ethan had considered possible. And for the first time since this began, he understood something with absolute clarity. This was not an incident he had stumbled into. This was something that had been waiting, and he had just stepped into the part where it decided to reveal itself. The corridor seemed to narrow further as her words settled, not physically, but in the way space can feel smaller when meaning expands beyond what it should comfortably contain. And Ethan stood there for a moment, aware that the next thing he said might not change the situation, but would certainly define his place within it. Queen Lyra did not move, her attention fixed on him with a level of precision that suggested she was no longer observing a person, but evaluating a variable that that had just entered a system it did not belong to. You are implying, Ethan said slowly, choosing the structure of his words as carefully as their content, that this is not the first time something like this has happened. Lyra's expression did not shift, but something in her gaze confirmed the direction of his thought before she spoke. Not like this, she said, and the distinction carried weight. The kind that suggested similarity without repetition, pattern without predictability. Ethan felt that same echo again, stronger now, less like a distant impression and more like something pressing against the edge of his awareness. Then what is similar? He asked, because at this point the question felt less like curiosity and more like necessity. Lyra regarded him for a moment longer before answering, and when she did, her voice carried a tone that had not been present before, not uncertainty, but something close to caution. Recognition, she said, and the word landed with quiet impact. Simple, but layered. Ethan frowned slightly, not out of confusion, but because the answer felt incomplete, like a fragment of something larger that had not yet been revealed. You recognized something, he said, more statement than question, and Lyra's ears shifted again, forward and still, focused in a way that suggested he had stepped closer to the center of whatever this was. No, she corrected softly. Something recognized you. And that changed everything, not in a dramatic way, not with visible consequence, but in the structure of the situation itself, because it shifted the focus away from her perception and onto something else entirely, something neither of them had directly named. Ethan felt the implication settle into place with a quiet sense of inevitability. And you do not know what that something is, he said, because if she did, this conversation would not be happening like this. Lyra did not answer immediately, and that pause was answer enough. When she finally spoke, her voice was lower, more contained, as if the uncertainty required tighter control. I know what it should not be, she said, and that was not reassuring, not even slightly. Ethan let out a slow breath, because there were only so many ways a situation could become more complicated before it stopped being surprising. That seems like an incomplete category, he said, because if humor was going to fail, it might as well fail consistently. Lyra's gaze held his, steady and unbroken, and for the first time since they had entered the corridor, the silence between them felt less like pressure and more like alignment, as if the conversation had reached a point where both of them understood that the next step would not come from words alone. There is a system beneath this palace, she said after a moment, the statement delivered without preamble, as if context was no longer necessary. It does not govern. It observes. Ethan felt a subtle shift in the air again, not mechanical, not entirely, but something layered into the structure of the environment itself. Observes what? He asked, because that felt like the only reasonable response to that kind of statement. Lyra's gaze did not waver, but something in it sharpened, not in suspicion, but in confirmation. Patterns that persist beyond individuals, she said. And Ethan understood then, not fully, not in detail, but enough to feel the weight of it. This was not about language, not about protocol, not even about her. It was about something larger, something that tracked continuity across time in a way that ignored the boundaries he had always assumed were fixed, and it reacted. He said quietly, because that was the only part that mattered now. Lyra inclined her head a fraction, the smallest acknowledgement. Yes, she said, it did. And the way she said it made it clear that whatever that system was, whatever it had detected, it had not been expecting him. And now that it had found him, the situation had moved beyond anything either of them could dismiss as coincidence. The words settled into Ethan's mind with a weight that did not belong to conversation, but to consequence. And for the first time since this had begun, he understood that whatever system lay beneath the palace was not reacting to what he had done, but to what he represented. Queen Lyra remained still, her presence no longer simply authoritative, but anchored, as if she were positioning herself between him and something neither of them could yet see. So it noticed me, Ethan said quietly, not as a question, but as a confirmation of the only conclusion that made sense. Lyra inclined her head a fraction, her gaze never leaving his. It did more than notice, she said, her voice steady but carrying an undercurrent that had not been there before, something closer to caution than control. It responded, and that distinction mattered, because noticing implied observation, but response implied interaction, and interaction implied intent. Ethan exhaled slowly, because that moved the situation into a category he was significantly less comfortable with. Systems do not usually respond to people like me, he said, because that had been a reliable assumption for most of his life, and it had served him well until now. Lyra's ears shifted again, that unfamiliar outward angle returning, and for a brief moment, something in her expression softened, not emotionally, but in a way that suggested she was adjusting her expectations rather than lowering them. That is because people, like you, are not usually visible to them, she said, and Ethan felt that settle into place. With a quiet inevitability, not reassuring, not alarming, just accurate in a way that suggested this had never been about chance, and now I am, he said, because stating the obvious felt necessary when the obvious had just changed. Lyra did not respond immediately, and in that pause, the corridor seemed to listen, not metaphorically, but with a subtle shift in the ambient field that made the air feel more attentive, more precise, as if something beyond their conversation had begun to focus on it. Yes, she said finally, and there was no ambiguity in it, no hesitation, just acknowledgement. Now you are. The silence that followed was different from the ones before, not tense, not expectant, but settled, as if a decision had already been made somewhere neither of them had direct access to. Ethan became aware of the faint hum beneath the floor, not mechanical in the traditional sense, but layered, complex, like a structure operating on principles he did not fully understand. What happens next? He asked, because if the system had responded, then there would be a continuation. There was always a continuation. Lyra held his gaze for a moment longer before answering, and when she did, her voice carried a level of clarity that made the words feel less like speculation and more like inevitability. It will test the pattern, she said, and Ethan felt a small, precise shift in his understanding. Not relief, not fear, but recognition of a process he had not agreed to be part of. And I am the pattern, he said, because that was the only interpretation that fit. Lyra did not correct him, which was confirmation enough. You are part of it, she said instead, and the distinction was not comforting. If anything, it suggested that whatever this was, it extended beyond him in ways he could not yet see. Ethan let out a slow breath, because there were only so many ways to respond to being informed that you were now part of something that should not exist and was about to be tested by a system you did not understand. That sounds like a situation I cannot opt out of, he said, and Lyra's gaze held his, steady and certain. Correct, she replied, and then, after a brief pause, that felt measured against something far larger than the corridor they stood in, she added, but it is also not a situation you entered by accident. And that was the final shift, the one that redefined everything that had happened up to this point, because it meant that this moment, this conversation, even that first misplaced word, had not been random at all. It had been the beginning of something that had been waiting, and now that it had found him, it was not going to let him disappear. Again,